Recognize and reporting abuse, neglect, and exploitation. This course will provide an overview of the various types of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. The training will cover the signs of abuse, neglect, and exploitation and will identify mandated reporters, as well as the care protocol that should be followed for victims of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. After completing this training, the participant will be able to define abuse, neglect, and exploitation, identify the different types of abuse, identify mandated reporters, and implement steps to report abuse. A caretaker can be a person who is paid or unpaid and has assumed responsibility for the care of an at-risk elder or has identified themselves as the elder's caretaker. It can be a family member, a home health provider, a facility staff, or a neighbor who has agreed to provide recurring assistance to help the older person meet his or her basic needs. Occasional shopping or cleaning for an at-risk elder does not mean the Good Samaritan has assumed responsibility for the at-risk elder's care. Types of abuse. Physical abuse. The use of physical force against someone in a way that injures or causes physical pain to that person. Emotional, verbal abuse or mistreatment. The use of threatening, humiliating, or intimidating words or actions. Sexual abuse, when a caretaker or provider forces, tricks, threatens, coerces, exploits, or otherwise engages a person with a disability in sexual activity, or permits another person to engage in non-consensual sexual activity. And financial abuse, the illegal or improper use of another person's funds, properties, or asset. Identifying physical abuse. Physical abuse occurs when a caretaker or provider assaults an individual by hitting, kicking, pushing, biting, burning, or in some way using physical force to hurt them. Physical abuse often results in bruises, fractures, cuts, sprains, or internal injuries. An assault should be reported even if there is not an injury. If an injury is observed on an individual, which would not be typical of bumping into something or falling, and the individual is not able to explain how it occurred, then it can be considered an injury of unknown origin. If there is no explanation for how the injury occurred, this may be due to abuse or neglect. Physical abuse can create trauma, stress, and emotional harm. Sexual abuse, also referred to as molestation, is defined as an abusive sexual behavior by one person upon another. It is often perpetrated by using force or taking advantage of another. Some indications that sexual abuse have occurred are as followed: physical evidence such as torn or stained clothing, injury to the individual, itching, swelling, or pain, and changes in the behavior or mood of an individual. There are special considerations that you should consider when sexual abuse is suspected. Do not bathe the victim of an alleged sexual assault or rape until they have been medically assessed. Do not change the clothes or change the bed linen where the incident took place. And it is important to preserve evidence which may be essential to an investigation. The investigator in charge of the case will provide direction. They will likely want the alleged victim to be assessed in an emergency room, preferably one that has a sexual assault nurse examiner, and will want to examine clothing and other evidence. You are not to impede the investigation of an alleged assault in any way. According to Wikipedia, neglect means to pay little or no attention or omission of proper attention to a person or thing. This can be inadvertent or willful. It is the act or condition of disregarding. Neglect occurs when a caretaker or provider fails to provide the support services that are required, which results in an injury, a risk, or in mistreatment. Some examples of neglect include a lack of proper supervision that leads to peer-to-peer violence, not providing proper attire for outside weather conditions, and an individual who requires close supervision suffers a preventable fall or otherwise injures themselves due to inattentiveness of staff. Exploitation means taking a vulnerable person's money or other assets against their will or without their knowledge. In other words, stealing from a vulnerable person. It also means deceiving, harassing, intimidating, or using undue influence to get a vulnerable person to do something against their will. Financial abuse or exploitation is defined as the mismanagement, misappropriation, improper use, waste, fraudulent taking, or taking without authorization or consent of personal funds or goods. Some examples of financial abuse and exploitation are: a caregiver or provider takes an individual's money. A caregiver or provider persuades an individual to give them money, to give them possessions, or to buy them something. Here is a scenario. A review of financial records and receipts could reveal financial exploitation. This information could provide reasonable cause to believe that financial exploitation has occurred and should be reported. Discrepancies in financial records could be exploitation or just poor record keeping. Falsification of records would be a strong indication of exploitation. Account of the actual cash that an individual has does not match up with what the records indicate they would have. There are receipts for items that the individual does not seem to possess. A caregiver or provider persuades an individual to give them money, to give them possessions, or to buy them something. Or there are bank account withdrawals with no indication of what happened to the money. Let's assess the situation. Is financial exploitation occurring as a result of Anne's request? You should report any incident, condition, or occurrence where there has been a reasonable cause to believe that an individual has been abused, harmed, exposed to risk, or been subjected to mistreatment due to the actions, inaction, or negligence of a caretaker or provider. A reasonable cause to believe is a standard that is less than a probable cause, but more than a suspicion, hunch, or gut feeling. Signs of caretaker neglect include unusual weight loss, malnutrition, dehydration, untreated physical problems, being left alone when unable to self-care or protect oneself, lack of medical aids, improper use of medication, or unsafe living conditions. Facts that could provide a reasonable person with cause to believe that abuse, neglect, mistreatment exists could include: you witness the abuse, neglect, or mistreatment, someone has reported it to you, you observe an injury to an individual, there are changes in the mood or behavior of the individuals, or other evidence such as records, documents, or photos. When suspecting abuse, neglect, or exploitation, you should consider all information available to you. This may include, but are not limited to, the location, nature, and extent of injury, if any, physical location of where the injury occurred, and any information that the individual may be able to offer. After considering all information known to you, ask yourself, is it reasonable of me to believe that abuse, mistreatment, or another reportable condition may have occurred? Does the information make sense? Abuse, neglect, and mistreatment must be reported when they are perpetrated by a caregiver or provider. If you cannot decide, make the report. It is better to err on the side of caution when reporting. What is omission of care? Failure to provide access to appropriate health care and support or educational services and withholding of necessities of life such as medication, adequate nutrition, and heating can all be considered omissions of care. Peer-to-peer violence, which does not involve omission by a caregiver, does not meet the standard of omission of care. However, there may be instances where a caregiver or provider is negligent in their support and attention to the individuals. This omission of care may lead to peer-to-peer violence. In this instance, the incident must be reported. Eric, a staff from John's organization, is transporting two individuals, Michelle and Pam, in a van to accompany them to their scheduled medical appointments. Michelle and Pam have a history of arguing with each other. Pam has a history of assaultive behavior. On the way to the appointment, the staff stops at a convenience store to buy some chips for themselves, leaving the individuals in a van. While alone, Pam punches Michelle in the nose. Assessing the situation of Pam and Michelle. Was Michelle injured as a result of staff negligence? There is not an omission of care in every instance of peer-to-peer violence. However, in this example, staff knew that there was a risk of assault if Pam and Michelle were left unattended. Staff decided to pursue a personal errand in neglect of their duties, which exposed both Pam and Michelle to risk. Mandated reporters include physicians, surgeons, physician assistants, osteopaths, medical examiners and coroners, registered nurses, hospital and long-term facility personnel, psychologists, social workers, dentists, fire protection personnel, pharmacists, personnel of banks, savings, and loan associations, caretaker staff members, physical therapists, chiropractors, and clergy. As a mandated reporter, you may be hesitant to report instances of abuse, neglect, or mistreatment because you find it difficult to report on a coworker or supervisor because you're with these people every day. However, as a mandated reporter, you must follow the law and report. There are 3 common reasons why mandated reporters don't report. I don't want to get my coworker or supervisor in trouble. They are responsible for their own behavior. Or I am not certain that this rises to the threshold of abuse and neglect. I can't believe they would do something like that. It must be a mistake. The do's when abuse is disclosed: do stay calm and remain non-judgmental. Do ensure the individual's safety and ensure the alleged abuser does not have access to the alleged victim. Do explain your requirement to immediately report and ask the individual if they would like to make a call. Do gather the essential information by asking questions about what happened, when and where it happened, who is the alleged abuser, and who else was present, and do prevent the loss or destruction of known evidence. The don'ts when abuse is disclosed: don't agree to keep information secret. Don't interpret or hide evidence. Don't conduct an investigation. Don't interrogate the alleged abuser or suspect. Don't touch physical evidence. Don't bathe, change clothes, or bed linens of an alleged victim until they have been medically assessed. If you are a mandatory reporter and you witness or become aware of an at-risk person who has been or is at imminent risk for mistreatment, you must make a report to law enforcement within 24 hours. The culture of secrecy cannot apply to covering up the abuse and mistreatment of vulnerable individuals. You are protected from retaliation by law. You should have as much information as possible about the at-risk person, the alleged perpetrator, and what is concerning you. Law enforcement will need the following information: the name and risk of the elder, a description of the alleged mistreatment and the situation, the nature and extent of the injury, who is the alleged perpetrator, and any other information that you feel is relevant. Immunity of the reporter means if you suspect something is wrong and act in good faith, you won't face criminal or civil charges. It is okay to make a report if you just suspect something is wrong. As long as you make the report in good faith, you are immune to any criminal charges or civil lawsuit for damages. You are not immune if you are the perpetrator of the mistreatment. If you knowingly make a false report of mistreatment, it is a Class 3 misdemeanor. If charged and convicted of false reporting, you could receive a fine of up to $750 or 6 months in jail, or both. If you make a false report and are found guilty, you will also be liable for any damages caused by your action. If you are a mandatory reporter and you willfully fail to make a report of an observed or suspected abuse, neglect, or exploitation of an at-risk elder, it is also a Class 3 misdemeanor. If charged and convicted of failing to report, you could receive a fine of up to $750, 6 months in jail, or both.